went from assistants, assistive AI to agentic AI, where it had some more independence. It had tool use. It could actually do things, not just chat with you, to autonomous AI, where it's starting to do some things without any help from humans, right? I would say I'm probably 70% excited, 30% terrified.
Hey guys, if you're loving the conversations we are having here on the Domino Effect, take a quick second to hit that like button.
And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. Every single subscription helps us trigger that next big domino.
Exactly. Growing the channel is what allows us to bring on even bigger guests and keep leveling up the content we make for you.
So drop a like, hit subscribe, and let's keep this chain reaction going. Now back to the episode.
Dennis, thank you for joining. We are so happy to have you on board the podcast, The Domino Effect. And for the audience who does not know Dennis is Global VP of R&D at Internet Brands. One of the brands you might have heard is WebMD. Before we get into the other details, Dennis, I would love to hear about your journey, your background.
Yeah, definitely. First off, thank you for having me on your podcast. I've had a very long journey in technology. I started off my career from after Berkeley, getting a major in computer science and business. And I worked in Silicon Valley for a couple years, mostly as a consultant. From there, I moved on to multiple startup companies, mostly in the LA area. And so that was a great experience. I got to work with a couple venture capital backed startups. I got to work with a couple of startups that I founded with some partners. And so I think I had a great journey experiencing that side of the tech world. And I moved on to eventually joining Internet Brands, which is very different, obviously, from the startup culture. And I think what was a good transition for me was I spent so many years on the side of the table where I was trying to build value from startups to be sold to the bigger companies. I knew exactly what it felt like to be on one side of the table, but I wanted to experience the other side of the table.
Right.
Yeah. And so being able to move over to Internet Brands gave me exactly that experience and perspective. And so it's been a great rounded journey for me to see it from both sides.
And Internet Brands is it fair to say is a conglomerate of, and then it has multiple brands under that holding company? Like how are they structured?
Yeah, that's right. I think that's how I would describe it. It's certainly a conglomerate. A lot of it has happened through acquisitions. And so as a result, we have such a diverse portfolio of companies, right, across many different verticals. Yeah, again, coming back to my journey, the cool thing about that for me is even though I've joined a large corporate company, I'm still feeling like a consultant, being able to work with a lot of different companies within this conglomerate.
Dennis, yeah, thanks again for joining our podcast here. So it's interesting. You've been with the company for over a decade now, I think, and you've had multiple sort of functions or roles. You started off, I believe, in the legal space, managing the legal function or supporting them, to now you're more in the technology evangelist, if I have to say, where you're also trying to shape up the AI strategy to a certain extent, impact and influence how the company is transforming, right? So in your current role, we're going to dive, straight into, since the topic these days, everyone talks about AI. You see that. I think it's an overused acronym in some aspects, but how do you see, as someone that's evaluating perhaps an AI suite of products or solutions that transform your organization, how do you see that process evolving? Is it where you are having a hard time seeing disparate systems or solutions to your company that's making it hard? Is there a clear winner in terms of when you're trying to disrupt how Internet Brands as a company?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that the role that I have now is probably the most exciting yet frustrating and challenging role that I've had, right? It's for the reasons that you mentioned. With AI, it's really hard to plan when things are moving that fast. We've been certainly tasked with identifying the best way to leverage AI across the tech organization, right? Across our organization here. But doing so is a massive challenge just because the target keeps on changing and you can't predict what's going to happen in 2 to 3 months. sometimes you can't even, sometimes you're surprised a week after week, right? And so trying to have some formulation of a vision and roadmap becomes a really, really fine balancing act. But that's been part of the challenge, right? Being able to keep up. At the end of the day, it's, you know, in corporate America, at the end of the day, our goal is to make sure that we can stay ahead of our competitors. And so as long as relatively we're able to do that, I think we're successful. And, I think so far we've done a fairly good job, but yeah, would love to, throughout this podcast, talk about some of those challenges that came about, right, to stay there.
Yeah, that's a good point. How are you keeping up? Are you like reading a lot of the research articles? I feel like there is like new frontier models being released like every month or so. I know Chat GPT just released one today.
Yeah. I will admit it's a full-time job just trying to keep up, right? And so I'm glad that this opportunity exists where I can focus on AI and figuring out how to leverage Gen AI, right, for the organizations, particularly the engineering teams. One of my predecessors mentioned to me, there's just no way that you can do it on the side, right? And he's precisely right. And I think that, fortunately, we saw it early on that the changes were going to be profound, and we saw the trajectory, and we were able to be intentional and dedicated around making it happen. Yeah, obviously things will happen organically over time as well. But I think in this particular situation, there's a lot of sense of urgency, right? And there isn't the luxury of time, especially I think in the engineering space, just because that's where it's hit the hardest and the fastest.
So, and maybe a controversial question, right? Do you see, AI playing more as an enabler, or that gives you you know, the extra value prop, or do you see it as a where it just levels the playing field, right? So in traditional economies, let's take a step back pre AI, right, where every company has a competitive edge. They have a secret sauce that makes them unique and makes them have the market share that they do, right? Do you feel that with AI now in the mix and the rate at which it's evolving and at how quickly companies are leveraging to adopt it, do you feel that AI is more of a leveler now, that competitiveness is sort of not gone but perhaps flattened, where now companies have to rethink on how to actually stay competitive and stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I think that right now, just being able to keep up gives you the competitive advantage, right? Because it's moving so fast, right? And
Hmm.
different companies are adopting at different rates. There's no doubt about that, right? And even within each organization, right, you get very, very different rates of awareness and adoption as well, right? And so I think being intentional still gives you the competitive advantage. At the macro level, though, it is interesting, right? Because the technology has become advanced so fast and has gotten commoditized very
Hmm.
quickly as well. And to your
Yeah.
point, as things get commoditized, it
Yeah.
creates an even playing field where everyone has it, everyone can use it. And I think that if you look at any maturity curve of technology, and this one is clearly a little bit different, but if you look at the maturity curve, there's opportunities as you climb that maturity curve, right? Innovation curve. And during that hype cycle, there's always opportunities to try to do better than your competitors. And I think the hype cycle will work pretty much the same, where if and when AI ever hits a plateau, we don't know if that's ever going to happen, but if it hits a plateau, then people obviously come in with their proprietary competitive advantage on top of the infrastructure, right? And the underlying technology.
Yeah.
Clearly in that trajectory right now of where the hype cycle is climbing very rapidly, right?
Yes.
So right now it's the most exciting time, right? But in terms of competitive advantage, I think it's what you've seen in the past where you're provided with so much enabling technology and things are moving so fast. Each company has the opportunity to adapt it as quickly as they want. And
Mm.
so we certainly are trying to adapt to it quickly here. One thing I see that's unique this time around is it feels like every company feels that urgency very, very fast, right? Around trying to adapt this technology. And
Yeah.
so I feel like that's unique for what's happening this time around.
Is there an aspect of FOMO or like fear of missing out as well? Like, because every company is now like, hey, like we need to have a strategy, AI strategy in place. We need to look at AI, right? How are you seeing any like any bottlenecks as you are looking at AI strategy, as you're trying to adopt this technology? What are some of the bottlenecks you are seeing in that case?
Yeah. Some of the bottlenecks I mentioned are um, some of the are what I mentioned earlier, which is it's really hard for us to plan accordingly just because it's hard to understand where the technology will be, right, in a few months. With that said, the technology is amazing, right? That's needless to say. The other challenge is awareness and education, right? I had mentioned that earlier as well. Across the industry, across any organization, aside from maybe OpenAI and Anthropic, right? The awareness and competency around utilizing AI has such a broad spectrum. And so I think it's just because of the speed of everything, right? It's causing major change management issues.
Mm.
We've never tried to change this fast. But to your question, what is a bottleneck? It's the change management, right? Because the technology is ready, the people are not.
Yeah, and what I've seen, at least, I would love to get your take on, is when the forcing function comes from top down, so from the CEO down, to say that, hey, we have no choice but to adopt AI or experiment with AI and figure how do you either increase value or increase efficiency with AI, versus when it's just organic and say, okay, let's just try it out, let's just see how, what's out there, let us know what works. A lot of companies, I think, are, well, they're successful companies that are able to, or are trying to get the enablement and, to your point, change management quicker, is when it comes from top down, which we've seen. We did a podcast earlier, but we've seen that more on companies in the in the eastern countries, whereas where it's so top down heavy, versus here the style is so different that sometimes the adoption is not as high. Do you feel the same, or do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in my experience, I'm seeing a lot more top-down approach to this, right? Not just personally here, but in the news as well, right? I think a lot of executives are very aware, and I guess optimistic might be the right word, that the technology will be able to do a lot of what it's promised. Yeah. So I'm seeing that. I'm seeing the top down approach being applied. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why things aren't changing as quickly as they are. While I mentioned that it's a bottleneck, it's all relative, right? The
Yeah.
change is still phenomenal. I mean, we're talking about big corporate America adopting and shifting and transforming, right, at this rate.
So here's a hypothetical, right? Or maybe it's not a hypothetical. Well, let's say AI is still maturing. So fast forward 2, 3, maybe 4 years down the line, right? Everyone's now right now AI is looked at as a optimization tool, right? Hey, it's something that can make my task go faster, do it quicker. So I don't need 10 people. I just need one person to validate or review the output. Fast forward 5 years from now, is human in the loop? Is that it going away? Do you see where the architecture becomes so complex that you just don't need the middle managers or the doers or the worker bees anymore, and it's just pure strategists perhaps that's needed?
We went from assistants, assistive AI, to agentic AI, where it had some more independence, it had tool use, it could actually do things, not just chat with you, to autonomous AI, where it's starting to do some things without any help from humans, right? To, the future is around agent teams and swarms and just much more sophisticated use of AI, right?
Mhm.
And we've seen that trajectory from assistive to autonomous, at least for certain use cases, happen within the last 9 months, right?
Yeah,
And
that's
so
true.
what's going to happen in the next 9 months with that exponential trajectory? And so it does blow my mind, even though I'm in it. I'm surprised that I can be as taken aback when I'm so in the industry, but that is where the technology is. The things that we're seeing come out of Anthropic and OpenAI, I think they've been very good about being open and publishing how they're using AI, what innovation they're seeing. It's pretty phenomenal in terms of how quickly they're advancing the intelligence and the capabilities and the autonomy behind it. We're going to see increasing use cases of that throughout the year. And this is where things obviously get a little bit weird and scary, right? And not to go too deep into the technology or the weeds, but what we're seeing is these frontier companies are leaning on the things that AI is good at. So first off, they know that the underlying large language models will keep improving, right? And so that's the fundamental intelligence. And what they've gotten very good at is layering on top more proprietary instructions or context to make it pragmatic to do business things, right? You can't just be a PhD out of, a great university to do great business work. You need that learning of what the business wants done, how it wants it done. So they're starting to figure out how to apply that context layer that they call skills on top of it.
Mhm.
And in addition to that, they're running multiple agents behind the scenes that collaborate with one another to validate and to assist, you know, us, assist in getting the job done. And so while you're interfacing with one agent from your perspective, there are multiple agents now working in tandem to be able to get beyond the flaws that you might see today.
Mhm.
And so they've applied all of this very quickly. And they're leaning on the things that AI does well, which is it can compute indefinitely. It doesn't get tired, right? You can put as much validation logic as you want and layer it on, right? And it can do it so quickly. And so they're taking a brute force approach to saying, okay, one agent isn't smart enough to do it, but I can now spin up a team of a dozen agents that have different roles that keep each other in check.
Mhm.
And all I need is compute to be
Yeah.
able to apply that brute force, right? So, yeah.
So as you said, it requires compute, and we know there are certain bottlenecks on the number of chips we have available, right? The demand is much higher than what the supply is right now, especially if you look at Nvidia, right, as a company providing these chips for data centers. We are also seeing other bottlenecks around network capabilities, right? We are on 5G. A lot of the AI, based on our previous conversations, is going to happen on the edge. That means our network bandwidth has to be higher. So the transitioning from 5G to 6G as another bottleneck, because that takes time. That takes years as far as like infrastructure is concerned. So are these bottlenecks going to hamper how AI is going to be used more and more in certain use cases? Like, what do you see from your experience?
Yeah, I'm not an expert around what the bottlenecks around data centers are, but we've all heard that there's an explosion of data centers being built today, right? I think we've done a pretty good job across the industry of keeping up with the compute needs. If you think about the growth that Anthropic has experienced in just the past few months, I'm surprised that they're able to continue scaling, right,
Mhm.
to the level of demand that they're seeing. I don't remember the specific numbers, but I think over the past quarter, Anthropic saw an increase of $5 billion in revenue. Can you imagine the compute power to be able to,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
to handle that load? Yeah. So, I think the good news is that people deep in the industry have been seeing this projection on computing needs, and they've already started laying out additional foundation and infrastructure for it. And this goes all the way up to the government level, right? I think Trump is trying to work with the tech companies to make sure that energy consumption isn't going to affect the average American, right? That's the level of compute power that's projected and expected. So I think that this is a very planned out effort all the way up to the government level. As far as we look at it, we don't worry about scaling. We expect that to continue scaling, but it's a good question, right? To see what ends up actually happening.
Yeah.
I mean, I think government regulation always is the laggard. It always lags behind, and it's the last one to keep up, right? But I think you're right. I think with the speed at which AI is just going, and Anthropic's the perfect example. I think governments I think have to come up with two things. One is a framework within their country, so that's global within their country, but also how do governments talk to each other, right? How do countries how do you have a framework? I think about like the World Wide Web, right? There was this unified framework that was agreed upon where everybody, no matter where you are in the world, you could interact on the internet. I think something similar has to be done very quickly in the AI space to ensure there's responsible AI, there's ethical AI, and there's no rogue actors that take advantage of that, right?
Yeah, I hope that does happen, right? I think the essay from Dario Amodi from
Yeah,
Anthropic, right? I think that was his cry for making sure that people started acting, right? The adolescence of technology, right?
yeah,
Yeah. So I think that's a very, very relevant topic right now and for the next, for the rest of the year.
yeah. I mean, so how do you see? I've read that article, and it got me thinking. Right, Dario's article is with the speed of AI. We know it can do a lot of things. It can even what we call it, sixth sense or gut feel or experience. All that is just with just data. At the end of the day, if I can consume and understand the context with data, I'm just as experienced as a PhD scholar or someone who has 20 years of experience. Where does that leave humanity, Dennis? I mean, do you see where, like, if I'm struck, whether it's us who are, not saying we're better, but we're experienced, we are all each experienced in our field, or someone just starting out, right? Just, going to college, they look at all of this stuff, they say, well, what do I do? Like, how do I stay relevant, or what do I need to do to survive? It's not so much, hey, what do I do to get a better paying job? It's survival, right? It's at that fundamental level. If AI is doing everything, at the human level, is humanity slowly is the relevance going down?
Yeah. That's a existential question for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've had too many discussions around it myself. I think that it's certainly um, a real topic, right? And I love how Dario began his essay on
Hmm.
the essay we were just talking about. He quoted from the movie Contact, right, where the movie started with the actress Jodie Foster being appointed as the ambassador to be the first person to speak to aliens that had landed on Earth. And they asked her, "What's the first question you're going to ask as ambassador of Earth?" Right? And she knew exactly what she was going to ask. And I'm going to paraphrase what she said, but essentially her question was, "How did you get here? How did you get to this level of advancement without destroying yourself?" Right? Because that is a truly universal fundamental question, I think. And, there's a lot of thinking around it, whether it's the great filter or other things around it. And it's interesting in that we've probably had threats in the past, like nuclear weapons and whatnot, but AI is probably going to be the first time that we've really faced that level of questioning
Hmm.
as to how do we as humanity get past this amazing technology to make it a benefit for humanity before destroying ourselves. And so, yeah, I think we're going to have to start thinking about things like that. And that was, I'm glad that that essay came out. I think that was a cry for making sure that we all start thinking about that.
And do you feel humans will be able to adapt to this new technology?
This is where we need to make sure that there's more awareness and education, right? I think that we're talking about it here, but we're the minority of people that might be aware of what's happening and what's to come. Um, yeah, I think one of the biggest worry is that this technology is advancing kind of behind the scenes without people being aware that it's about to have a major impact on everyone's lives, right? So, yeah, I don't know how we solve that, but I think that, but obviously everyone is going to be impacted, and so everyone should be aware at the very least, just for your day-to-day livelihood and for your career, right? We don't know what the future is going to hold. We're talking about macro things right now, but just day to day, it's imperative, right, to be able to keep up with AI just because it's such a competitive edge, right, that you need today.
You know, right now, a lot of people are saying that, this whole concept of human in the loop is going to go away, right? As things get more complex. I was, so people are talking about the AI in the consumer space in the last, it's gotten a lot of traction in the last 2 to 4 years. But this has been going on for the last 15, 20 years in the military space. So in military, they already have AI, they've already been working with AI to the point where once, a drone is let go, or a missile is let go, there are thinking systems within the missile that they're just making, systems within the missile that can pivot based on conditions as conditions change in its trajectory, right? And to them, the only human in the loop there is the one making the decision to fire the missile. Once the missile's fired, decision making is completely autonomous. So it's interesting how it's not a new concept in the military, because I think every technology advancement we see in the consumer space or enterprise space was done, but it was tested and proven in the military first or in the defense first. So what's interesting, right? I mean, even with all of those I look at that as as perhaps is that, we still have a lot of people that are needed for the defense or for military, right? It's not completely AI or completely machine operated, but they've been doing this for, last 15, 20 years, where even though a lot of it is autonomous, you do need strategists. So there's still room for humans to need to make that decision making. And I wonder if there's anything to learn from what they've been doing for the last 10, 15 years, is that what we are going through, or would we follow the same path in the consumer space, right?
Yeah, that's a good observation, and I hope you're right. I
Yeah.
think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, military personnel certainly still exist for a reason, right? And ultimately, we're all trying to identify, what is the change in work, and the expectation is that we will be doing higher value work, right? And so I think most of that will be true, but I think right now, at least in the tech space, we know what that higher value work looks like in the short to medium term. It's that long term, right, where things get very, very dicey, right, in terms of how can what does higher value work look like when you're working with potentially super intelligence, right? So that's much further down the road, right? Hopefully, but at least for the next several months or next few years, I think that as we continue climbing that maturity curve, I think the good thing is we have a good definition of what that higher value work is, right? A lot of it is around really getting good at workflow definition, right? Business strategy definition. Ultimately, a lot of it needs to be well contextualized, right? Before the AI can operate on it. And so I think we're going to see a wave of skill set shifting to writing context as
Mm.
opposed to actually doing it day to day, right? And that way you get the multiplier effect.
Can you explain to our audience when you say focus on context?
Yeah. So if you think about almost anybody's white collar job as to what you do day to day, there's probably a pattern. There are workflows. There are certain logic gates that you do, whether you do it consciously or not. And so imagine trying to define your workday and the different parts of what you do throughout the day. And how do you define it? And how do you lay it out in an organized way? And if you can do that, that's context, basically. If you can lay out that definition and supply that context to AI, you can have AI help and essentially do that work with you or for you. And so I think we're in an age of the AI being smart enough and being agentic enough to do many things, but for it to do what you want, it's up to you, it's up to us to very clearly define that context, right? So that it follows exactly how you think and what you would want to do.
And what are some ways to, I guess, like provide that context to the
Yeah,
AI which
so
you're
I
working
think a
with?
lot of tooling and technology is quickly evolving, and it depends on the field that you're working in, right? So I'll use Anthropic just because they're the leader in the space. If you're in sales enablement, you might use something like Claude Cowork, right, to help you identify some of that context through writing skills within Claude Cowork. If you're an engineer, you would use Claude Code, And you would also write skills, right? But these skills are perhaps a lot more technical and specific as to the patterns around how you code and the things that you do. And so I think one of the direction, at least for now, that we're seeing things move towards is modularity and composability of these context files, now called skills. And you can imagine as we develop these skill context files, there's going to be libraries and communities and proliferation of different skills where you'll be able to share your skills, Vandeep, with Girish and back and forth, depending on things that make sense for each of you. And so you'll be able to enhance how you operate or how the AI operates for you as you start compounding these skills. And so, yeah, I think that's going to be a major lift, right, that we see over the next several months as people start building these proprietary skills that the underlying model doesn't have. And with that combination, that's when you get real value, right? Because that's when you get the proprietary business competitive edge layered on top of the AI to really help you with the things that you actually do day to day.
Do you see companies that have a hard time doing that? Do you see a use of AI where, hey, you know what? I'm not really sure. So why don't I have AI scour and monitor and go through all of my transactions, my data, and my whatever I have that I can give, and let AI tell me what my and figure out what the context is and tell me how to transform? Or are we heavily dependent, where, oh my God, I'm asking a machine to tell me how to run my business, right?
Right. Yeah, it's funny. We've all gotten used to leaning on AI,
Right.
even to instruct AI, right? So it's become very meta for us. Yeah, what we're seeing is you can absolutely start with having AI help with that, right? So there's actually a skill written by Anthropic that's called skill creator. And so it's this meta skill because you want to create a skill, they have a skill to help you create a skill. And it actually does a very good job of laying out what's important to be in the skill and it'll get you started around it. But in terms of the general population and, how people will be able to tune in and really use it well, I think that's where we're going to be seeing some of that change management and fundamental shift, right? Because it's one thing for you to do your job day to day. It's another thing to be able to define it really, really eloquently in a skill file, right? And so this is where we're going to probably start seeing reskilling, right? Or just, what higher value work looks like and what that skill set looks like, right? And so, yeah, we'll have to see how things shape up, but certainly some people will have a natural knack for it versus others. And those that do have a knack for it, I think will be the force multiplier, where if they can write really, really good context, it only takes a few people to do it. You can reuse that context, right, for the broader organization.
Yep.
You, yeah.
Go ahead, Mandeep.
No, I was just saying, you mentioned about the valuable human work. Like, how do we define it? I think we'll see in the next few years. Do you think we'll place a higher premium on physical presence, empathy, leadership as we are going through this motion and trying to figure out what that valuable human work is going to be?
Yeah, that's always going to be valuable for humans, of course. I think it's hard to answer that question or hard to think about it because it's unclear if your consumer or the audience is a human or an agent, right? I think we're going to start blurring the lines down the road, right? And this is where things get really weird and wonky, right? Where if we now have agents working alongside humans, who's the, you know, who are you catering to at that point, right? So it's going to be a very, very interesting transition, right? Where um, those questions won't be as easy to answer because I don't know who the audience is.
Yeah.
Where do you guys think we'll be by the end of the year? Right. I'm curious about your thoughts based on your experiences.
I'll give you my experience. I would say, like, definitely the pace is pretty rapid, right? Like there are new models coming up. In my personal life, I'm able to automate a lot of the daily chores I do, right? Like, hey, like, summarize this for me, or like create a point of view for a customer as an example. like knowledge base, right? Like those are the things we have been using AI I would say pretty easily. I am definitely kind of curious how this agentic, like spawning sub agents, right? And agents working with other agents. I haven't seen that in a production environment. I mean, yeah, theoretically you can do that, but how scalable it is, like what's the performance look like? How do we control the performance of these teams of agents working, right? How are they achieving these outcomes? I mean, that's still to be seen. But yeah, I mean, the technology definitely is going in that direction, right? We even in my personal life and the company I work for, we talk about agentic enterprise as an example, right? Companies are looking at that aspect. Girish, I'm curious on what you are seeing in your.
So I agree. I think look, it's everybody knows the pace is just unprecedented, right? It's just crazy how, I mean, look at Anthropic, look at OpenAI. They're just reaching for the frontiers on every week sometimes, or every 2 weeks, right? And I do see by end of the year, AI will be a lot better in contextualizing things. I think AI will also be a lot better in not just automating tasks, but also thinking and providing, responses or answers or strategies. I do sometimes wonder, how good is the feedback loop in terms of to keep hallucinations in check. So AI can be very convincing. A simple thing, you ask any like, I use Gemini, I don't know, 100 times a day, right? But if I could ask any question to Gemini, and the answer is always as the I would like to think that I ask good questions, but the response I get from the AI is always, you've asked the greatest question ever, and let me tell you, and the response is so convincing that it almost makes me believe that is 100% true. It's only later on when you start researching into it, I'm like, hang on a second, did you, and you start prompting some more, right, and say, hey, but did you take into account this variable, this thing? And then you can see it actually kind of learning on the fly and say, oh yeah, you're right, let me put that in, right? So, and I'm sure that'll get better, no doubt about that, and it'll get better very quickly. But I wonder, and I'm curious to see, how do we keep these hallucinations in check, or and if it's AI, monitoring other AI agents, then, how is the AI agent that's doing the monitoring even know that it's right or wrong? Or what's the basis of it, right? How is that any different from the worker bee? And how, if it's feeding off of the same information or source information or contextualization, right? That's the piece I'm very interested to knowing.
Yeah. Yeah. Hallucination is a very weird flaw, right, within the
Yeah.
LLMs. Yeah. But I think what we've seen with multi-agent systems is that, weirdly enough, even though one agent hallucinates, you can have a validator agent that recognizes that first agent is hallucinating.
Mm.
So the hallucination is not a fundamental, gap in knowledge. It happens just because of the way the large language models work. There's some technical reasons such as context window limitations and things like that. But yeah, that's obviously one of the biggest problems today. The good thing is that there are a number of benchmarks that measure hallucination across these models, and they have been improving over time. And so I think one of the things that these frontier models are trying to get to is, if an AI doesn't have enough confidence, rather than hallucinate, right, just kind of admit it. And so that's a hard thing for AI to do for some reason, but they're moving in that direction.
you know I also, and this is probably taking a bit of a tangent, but I also, look at how is AI disrupting just education in general. you know and I know it's the traditional education is, hey, I'm receiving education from, most cases, who's an SME in the subject. They've spent, quite amount of effort and time, getting a PhD, a doctorate, so which means they've gone really deep into that subject, to the point where I'm now receiving instruction or education from someone who's learned in that field. But with AI now around, has that reversed, where, our colleges or universities, they're learning probably the same speed as perhaps, anyone in the industry is. And are they going to now look towards, industry, or towards an Anthropic or a OpenAI, for example, to say, hey, we need to understand, they're the real teachers or the scholars, right? Are the roles reversed, in how people ultimately receive their education in the world of AI? Is that something, Dennis, you thought about, or what are your thoughts?
Not in those regards, but I do think about what it means for the value of education, right? In general, I think I do worry about future generations, right? In terms of their motivation and their fear of, why do I need to learn this? It's a little bit like
Just
when we were
ask the
kids.
AI to do this for me.
Right, right. AI is going to do it so much better, right? So I think it's more impactful than during our years when we got a calculator, a fancy scientific calculator, and we said, why do we need to do this? We have a scientific calculator. It can do it, right? But this is next level, right? So I can imagine their psychology around it as to, wait a minute, if AI is going to do it, why do you need me to try to mimic it? Yeah, I won't do it as well. And so I,
Do you think that will make humans stupid?
yeah, it's a worrisome thought, right? I think that even for us adults, I have no doubt that there are a number of people that immediately go to AI for some of the hard questions before they do the critical thinking now. They automatically lean on AI. And so I think we have to consciously be aware of that and make sure we do some critical thinking before just pivoting to AI. So I think it's a danger, right? To be leaning on AI. I don't know what it means, right, in terms of the future of human intelligence and the risk that it's going to provide. But it's certainly, yeah, something we need to address.
Yeah, it's a lack of, or lack of, is artificial intelligence the real intelligence? Is that where we're heading towards, right? I mean, I see it, in my just day-to-day interactions, like the critical thinking component, has definitely, especially with the younger, and this is not I'm not trying to bash the Gen Zs or the Gen As or, the younger generation, but I do see that there's an over dependence on, wait, if I don't, like to your point, Dennis, if I don't have to think about something and I can outsource that and it'll give me an answer within 0.05 seconds, then I'm not going to spend any effort or thought in doing that. Nor do I want to, nor do I want to have any interest in finding out more about something. I just want the answer right now. Someone tell me what do I need to do next?
Right.
It's scary, but
Yeah. It is. And yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what the answers are there. Right. And one thing I do find interesting is how optimistic some people are around this, like Elon Musk. I find it hard to see how we transition from a capitalistic society to a utopian one where AI takes care of everything and everyone's standard of living gets better. I
Gets
hope
better.
that happens. That's certainly a possible path. Yeah. The one thing that I
Or
have
or it
trouble is
goes
understanding
into
what's that
the
bridge.
dystopian direction where you have the power or the control is in the few on the top, and then rest of us are on
Right.
universal
Right.
basic income.
He has a very different perspective on it,
Yeah. Yeah.
for sure.
So I guess, like, to that point, on a scale of excited to terrified, where do you land with AI now, and why?
Yeah, that's a great way to think about the barometer. I was super, super excited. I'm still super excited, but I was leaning heavily on the excited spectrum and 6 months ago and plus. And then over the past 3 months or so, because things have been moving so fast, I would say I'm probably 70% excited, 30% terrified. So we'll have to see. I think that there are there are more and more questions coming up, right? Just because of the speed of change. And I worry about how to address it, especially for my level, right? Where I've got to provide guidance. I've got to provide vision, right? And so understanding what that higher value work is, I think is going to be more and more challenging as time passes. Fortunately, for the short to medium term, I've got more excitement than worry because I think we at least have that vision around what is that higher value work, right? And things like that, like we talked about context and whatnot.
I think with every disruption, there's opportunities to reinvent, right? The problem with AI that I see is, and I don't think anyone's not noticing that, but I think the rate at which things are being disrupted is so quick that it's just becoming overwhelming, because by the time you think about, oh, let me look for the next big opportunity, it's already gone. And so I think that it's my fear is not so much that the things are going to be disrupted. That's okay. You just have to force yourself to think differently. The problem is, the rate at which the disruption is occurring. We humans only have a certain amount of bandwidth to be able to keep up that quickly with the rate of innovation. I think that's what's.
Yeah, it is. Another thing I find interesting across the industry is typically in an age where you have massive innovative change that's disruptive, right? It's the startups that really, really take charge and really show the opportunities. And this time around, you've got a lot of the incumbents, right? Whether it's Google or, Facebook or Grok on on X and whatnot, that are really doing a good job of staying relevant and staying on top of the technology, right? I think there are still plenty of opportunities for smaller startups, but I feel like we've hit an age where incumbent companies are a lot more nimble as well, right? And so it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out right across the landscape.
Would you say that's still true for software companies? Because we saw in the last like 3 months where a lot of the software companies' stocks took a big hit because everybody had this fear of AI is going to disrupt the SaaS companies, right? And that space. Would you say that incumbents in that space have done a good job, or they are still trying to figure out how do we position ourselves, especially with AI coming?
Yeah. I personally think that that was an overreaction on the market, right? It's not, doom and gloom in the immediate future, right? If anything, it's going to have to shake out over time still, just because a lot of these decisions are hinged upon humans making decisions, right? And so it's not going to move that fast. In terms of software companies, absolutely. I mean, just like non-software companies are thinking about AI, software companies are even thinking about AI even more, right? And so, yeah, I think that as far as I can tell, as far as my senses from, what I've seen, there's there's nobody turning a blind eye to AI, right? Everyone's trying to really figure out how to take advantage of it, and so I think that's wonderful, right? I think that we've hit a culture and we've hit a um, phase, I guess, in communication where there's just so much information. There's a lot less lead time as a result, right? And so things are not only moving fast because AI is moving fast, but because that's how our work environment works now, right? And so again, that makes it pretty exciting. I think the software companies will find their competitive edge. We'll have to see what that looks like. And I think it's one of those things we'll probably see it by the end of the year, right? It's going to happen pretty quickly.
Yeah. The other thing I wonder is, how much of industries where human sentiment is so high is valuable, right? For example, if you're in healthcare, just the care you receive from your doctor versus like a stock market where, it's not always about facts, right? I mean, sure, there's short term, ups and downs, but human sentiment plays a lot of a factor, a lot in the output of a share price, for example, right? And I wonder with AI now coming into the mix, and this is where I think what we talked about the context learning, is it going to are things still going, is human sentiment still going to be valuable or relevant in areas where, that we're so used to seeing or receiving, or is it just going to be purely like, what, this is, a robot or a agent, or it's all about, facts and no human emotion or sentiment that's relevant, at least from a day-to-day transacting.
Right. Yeah, I personally value the empathy, right? If you've ever gone through any health crisis and whatnot, you know
Yeah.
that, all that goes out the window. It's not just facts. It's really about empathy and really mental health and everything else, right? So yeah, I personally don't think that goes away. With that said, we're seeing enough of an AI industry around relationships, right? Which implies that AI can be trained, right, to maybe have empathy, right? And so again, it will be interesting to see how that shapes up, because anytime you have a demand or a need for something with AI, it's really about training it and defining it, right? So we'll have to see what that might look like.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a new way of, is AI going to teach humans a different way of interacting with each other or with agents, right? It's time will tell, but we're living in fascinating times for sure.
Yeah.
I was actually watching another podcast last week, and this was Geoffrey Hinton, who's supposed to be the founding fathers of AI. And he was saying basically these large language models can actually think, not simulating thinking, but they're actually thinking. Does that change anything for you in the sense that if they can think, can AI actually have malice against humans as they evolve? Any thoughts on that front?
Yeah. Obviously, very controversial subject around, if AI can think, if they might have consciousness, right? Things of that nature. And personally, for me, being the logical person that I am and more of a science background, my general sense is that if we can't even define consciousness, what is consciousness? We can't say that AI can't be conscious because we can't even define it, first of all. And secondly, our brains are wired in a certain way for us to believe we think the way we think. And so ultimately, if you can get AI to be wired in the same way and it's thinking in the same way and it thinks it feels what you feel, right? I don't see why AI would not potentially get to the level of wiring that we have. And so, yes, I think those are things I would worry about much longer term, right? Where it believes it feels malice. It believes it feels anger, right? And just like we believe it, but that's just our wiring. And so I feel like with the advancements of the model and how they're wired, you know, it may feel the way we feel, right, one day. And that might be indistinguishable from our brain wiring versus machine wiring. So that's my take on it. But obviously, we need more of a philosopher to come in.
We did see, I think Anthropic was sharing that while they were doing some training, AI was actually trying to blackmail them about certain things like survival bias, right? So they saw some of those elements as they were going through their training for Claude. So
Right.
that was very interesting.
Yeah, it is. And, I bring it back to how we're wiring AI to think, right? And so it may feel that threat. We don't know what that threat feels like to AI, but apparently we're wiring it in such a way that it's reacting in similar ways. And if you react in the same way and you perceive it in the same way, are you feeling the same way we do? Maybe, maybe not. So it becomes very, very gray.
Wonderful. Well, Dennis, any last thoughts on the way you see? Is it all doom and gloom, or do you see that it's there's a chance for, I guess, not human survival, but just is it an opportunity more for how we once again, humans have to think about reinventing, not just how to operate in a work environment, but just how to live, survive and live.
Yeah, it's so uncertain right now, but exciting, right, at the same time. And so I don't want to come off as doom and gloom, right? I think that the best way for me to put it is I think AI is going to bring the best of times and the worst of times. So we just need to get ready. And the more that we can get educated, I think the better the opportunities for any of us and all of us.
Dennis, if you could ask the most advanced AI in the world one question and it had to answer it completely honestly, what would you ask?
But that's a really, really tough question. I think because it's top of mind right now, I would love to know what the answer is to that question from Contact. What is that path to super intelligence not becoming self-destructive? Right. And I would love, if we had a path, at least we would know what to follow.
Yeah, I know what I would ask. I would be like, all the sci-fi movies that Hollywood has churned over the years, is that coming true in reality?
Yeah.
Are we going to live the movie?
I would just say thank you, Dennis, for giving us some time today in your Friday afternoon. Yeah, that was a great discussion. Thank you for all the great nuggets.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, it's absolute pleasure and privilege to have you on our podcast. And, it's been a joy chatting. And I'm sure, love to chat with you some more on, we could go on and have this a 3-hour podcast, but definitely interesting times ahead. I'm sure, the conversations will change every few months, right? Depending on how fast and how much of changes happen. So thank you so much for taking the
Thank
time.
you. Thank
Yeah,
you, Dennis.
absolutely. Thank you for having me.